The phone woke me at 3:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I stared at the clock for several seconds before reaching for it, trying to decide if answering would make whatever was coming real. A man's voice, strained and formal. He said his name was Dr. Mehta and he was calling from County General Hospital. He asked if I was Rebecca Callahan. I said yes. He asked if I was the daughter of Thomas Callahan. I said I was. He said, "Your father was brought into the emergency room about an hour ago. He collapsed at a bus station downtown. We found your contact information in his wallet." I sat up. My mouth felt dry. I said, "My father died 18 years ago." There was a pause. I could hear voices in the background, the beeping of machines. He said, "Mom, the ID we have says Thomas Callahan, date of birth June 14th, 1948. Is that your father?" I said yes, that was his birthday. Dr. Mehta said, "He's in critical condition. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." I asked what was wrong with him. He said, "I'd rather discuss that in person." I got dressed in the dark. My husband didn't wake up. He sleeps through everything. I left a note on the kitchen counter and drove across the city in silence, watching the streetlights blur past. I kept thinking about the funeral, the casket, the cemetery in the rain, my mother standing beside me in a black dress, her face carved from stone. I was 23 then. I'd just finished college. My father had been 57, supposedly killed in a car accident on a business trip to Denver. I parked in the hospital garage and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Dr. Mehta met me outside the ICU. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes and the kind of calm that comes from delivering bad news too many times. He took me to a consultation room. I didn't sit. He said my father had suffered a massive stroke. They'd stabilized him, but the damage was extensive. He was unconscious, on a ventilator, and the prognosis wasn't good. I asked if I could see him. He nodded and led me down the corridor. We stopped outside a room with glass walls. Inside, a man lay in a bed surrounded by machines. His face was gaunt, his skin gray, his hair thin and white. He looked old. Ancient, but I recognized him. The shape of his nose, the line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off a ladder when I was 8. I stood there staring through the glass, and something inside me went very still and very cold. Dr. Mehta said, "Is this your father?" I said, "Yes." He asked if I had any questions about his condition. I shook my head. He said a nurse would come find me shortly to discuss next steps. Then he left. I walked into the room and sat down in the chair beside the bed. I looked at the man who was supposed to be dead. I looked at the machines keeping him alive. And I tried to understand what I was seeing. The funeral had been closed casket. My mother had said the accident was too severe, that it would be better to remember him the way he was. There had been a death certificate, an obituary, a gravestone. I'd grieved him. I'd spent years grieving him. And now he was here, alive, 70, 5 years old, dying in a hospital bed with my phone number in his wallet. A nurse came in a few minutes later. She introduced herself as Karen and asked if I needed anything. I asked how they'd found my contact information. She said his wallet had a card with my name and number listed as emergency contact. No address. Just the number. I asked if there was anything else in the wallet. She hesitated, then said she'd check. She came back 10 minutes later with a plastic bag. Inside was a worn leather wallet, a state ID, a bus pass, $37 in cash, and a small photograph. The photograph showed a little girl sitting on a man's shoulders, both of them smiling. I recognized it immediately. It had been taken at a zoo when I was 6. I asked Karen if there was any other identification. A social security card, insurance, anything. She said no, just the ID. I asked where he'd been living. She said the address on the ID was for a rooming house on the east side. She didn't know anything more than that. I thanked her and sat back down. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I put it in my purse and left the hospital. I didn't go home. I drove to the address on my father's ID. It was a 3-story building in a neighborhood I'd never been to. The kind of place with bars on the windows and graffiti on the walls. I parked across the street and waited until the sun came up. At 7:30, I knocked on the front door. A woman in her 60s answered, suspicious and tired. I asked if Thomas Callahan lived there. She said, "Room 12." Second floor, but he ain't here. Ambulance took him last night. I said I was his daughter. I asked if I could see his room. She studied me for a moment, then shrugged and let me in. The hallway smelled like cigarettes and mildew. She led me upstairs and unlocked a door at the end of the corridor. The room was tiny, a single bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. Everything was clean but bare. No pictures on the walls, no books. No personal items except for a small stack of mail on the dresser. I asked the woman if she knew my father. She said he'd been living there for about 3 years. Kept to himself. Paid rent on time. Didn't cause trouble. I asked if he'd ever mentioned family. She said no. I thanked her and asked if I could have a few minutes alone. She nodded and left. I went through the mail. Mostly junk, but there were a few bills. A bank statement from a local credit union showing a balance of $418. A notice from Social Security. A letter from a veterans clinic. I opened the dresser drawers. Clothes, all of them old and worn. In the bottom drawer, underneath a folded sweater, I found a small box. Inside were more photographs. Pictures of me at different ages. School photos, birthday parties, my college graduation. Pictures he shouldn't have had. Underneath the photos was a newspaper clipping. My wedding announcement from 6 years ago. And beneath that a stack of letters. I opened the first one. It was addressed to my mother, dated 1994. The year before he supposedly died. The handwriting was my father's. The letter was short. He said he was sorry. He said he'd made mistakes he couldn't undo. He said he hoped she'd understand someday. He asked about me. I opened the next letter. Same year, 3 months later. He asked if she'd received his last letter. He asked how I was doing. He said he missed us. I went through all of them. 12 letters in total spanning 3 years. 1994 to 1997. All addressed to my mother, none of them opened. They'd been returned to sender. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the letters in my hands. My father hadn't died in a car accident. He'd left, or been forced out. And my mother had let me believe he was dead. I put everything back in the box and took it with me. When I got home, my husband was in the kitchen making coffee. He asked where I'd been. I told him. He stared at me, trying to process it. He asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know. He asked what I was going to do. I said I needed to talk to my mother. My mother lived 40 minutes away in the same house I'd grown up in. I called her and said I was coming over. She asked if everything was all right. I said we needed to talk. She said she'd put on tea. I arrived an hour later. She met me at the door, smiling, her silver hair perfectly styled. She'd always been composed even when things fell apart. Especially then. We sat in the living room. She poured tea. I waited until she was settled, and then I said, I got a call from the hospital last night. Dad's alive? Her hand froze halfway to her cup. She didn't look at me. She said, That's impossible. I said, He's in the ICU at County General. He had a stroke.
He's dying.
She set the teapot down very carefully. She said, You must be mistaken. I said, I saw him. I spoke to the doctors. I went to his apartment. I found the letters, Mom, the ones you sent back. She looked at me then, and her face was unreadable. I said, What happened? She didn't answer right away. She picked up her cup and took a sip of tea, as if we were discussing the weather. Then she said, Your father made choices, bad choices. I did what I had to do to protect you. I said, Protect me from what? She said, From the truth. I waited. She set her cup down. She said, Your father had another family, another woman, another child. He'd been living a double life for years. I found out in 94. I confronted him. He didn't deny it. He said he wanted a divorce. I told him if he left, he'd never see you again. I felt something twist in my chest. I said, So you told me he died? She said, He might as well have. He walked away from us. I wasn't going to let him come back when it was convenient. I said, Tried to reach out. He wrote you letters. She said, I didn't want to hear from him. And I didn't want you to either. You were better off thinking he was gone. I said, That wasn't your decision to make. She looked at me, her expression hardening. She said, I was your mother. It was exactly my decision to make. I stood up. I said, He's dying. Do you care? She didn't answer. I left. I went back to the hospital. My father was still unconscious, still hooked to machines. A different doctor was there, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Huang. She explained that the stroke had caused significant brain damage. Even if he survived, he likely wouldn't regain consciousness. She asked if I wanted to discuss end-of-life care. I asked if there was any legal documentation, a living will, a healthcare proxy, anything. She said no, as his next of kin. The decision was mine. I asked if there was any other family. She said not that they'd found. I sat down and thought about what my mother had said. Another family, another child. I asked Dr. Huang if she could check his medical records for any other emergency contacts. She said she'd look. She came back 20 minutes later with a name, Diane Mercer, listed as a contact in a file from a veterans clinic he'd visited 2 years ago. There was a phone number. I called it. A woman answered. I said I was calling about Thomas Callahan. She went very quiet. Then she said, "Is he all right?" I said no. I explained what had happened. I told her I was his daughter. She said, "I'm his daughter too." Her name was Diane. She was 39, 6 years younger than me. She said our father had lived with her and her mother until she was 16, then disappeared. She'd spent years looking for him, but he'd vanished. She'd only reconnected with him 3 years ago, when he'd shown up at the veterans clinic where she worked as a nurse. She said he'd never told her about me. I said he'd never told me about her either. We agreed to meet at the hospital. Diane arrived an hour later. She looked like him, same nose, same eyes. We sat in the waiting room and didn't know what to say to each other. Finally, she said, "Did you know about us?" I said no. She said, "Me neither. About you, I mean." My mom said he was working out of state. Then one day he just didn't come home. She said he'd probably found someone else and moved on. I said, "My mom said he died in a car accident." Diane looked at me. She said, "Jesus." We sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "What do we do?" I said, "I don't know." Dr. Huang came and spoke to both of us. She said our father's condition hadn't changed. She said we needed to make a decision about continuing life support. She said there was no brain activity. He wasn't coming back. Diane and I looked at each other. She said, "He's your father too. You decide." I said, "Let's decide together." We talked for a long time. We talked about what he would have wanted, though neither of us really knew. We talked about our mothers, about the lies we'd been told, about the man we'd both lost in different ways. In the end, we agreed. We told Dr. Huang to remove life support. He died 2 hours later. Diane and I were both there. We stood on opposite sides of the bed and watched the machines go quiet. When it was over, we walked out of the hospital together and stood in the parking lot, not knowing what came next. Diane said, "Do you want to get coffee?" I said yes. We sat in a diner until midnight. We talked about our childhoods, our families, the strange parallel lives we'd lived. We talked about the father we'd shared but never really known. Diane said her mother had passed away 5 years ago. She said when our father had come back, she'd been angry at first. But he'd looked so broken, so lost, that she couldn't stay angry. She'd helped him find a place to live. She'd checked on him. She'd tried to build something, even if it wasn't what it should have been. I asked why he'd kept my picture. She said, "Because he never stopped being your father, even if he stopped acting like it." I didn't know what to do with that. We exchanged numbers. We said we'd stay in touch. I didn't know if we would, but it felt right to say. I went home and told my husband everything. He held me while I cried. I didn't cry for my father. I cried for the years I'd spent believing a lie. I cried for Diane, who'd been lied to in a different way. I cried for all the wasted time. The next day I called my mother. I told her he'd died. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry you had to go through this." I said, "Are you sorry he's dead?" She didn't answer. I said, "I met his other daughter. Her name is Diane. She's a nurse. She took care of him when no one else would." My mother said, "Rebecca." I said, "I don't want to hear it. You lied to me for 18 years. You let me grieve someone who was alive. You kept me from knowing I had a sister. You made that choice, and you never told me the truth. I can't forgive that." She said, "I did what I thought was right." I said, "You did what was easy." I hung up. I haven't spoken to her since. I don't know if I will. Some part of me understands why she did it. The anger, the betrayal, the need to protect me from pain. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving. Diane and I stayed in touch. We meet for coffee once a month. We talk about small things mostly. Work, weather, books we're reading. We don't talk about our father much. There's not much to say. We buried him in a small cemetery near where Diane lives. Just the two of us. No service, no speeches. We planted a tree instead of putting up a headstone. It felt more honest. I think about him sometimes. I think about the choices he made, the lives he fractured, the years he spent alone in a rooming house, with a box of photographs he couldn't send. I think about my mother and the lies she told to protect me, or herself. I think about how easily the truth can be buried and how long it can stay hidden. I think about Diane, who forgave him when she didn't have to, who gave him something at the end that no one else would. And I think about the photo in his wallet. Me at 6 years old, sitting on his shoulders, smiling like the world was simple. I kept that photo. I don't look at it often, but I keep it. Some people vanish by dying. Others vanish while they're still alive. And some spend their whole lives caught between the two, not quite gone but never fully there. My father was all three. If you've ever discovered that the story you were told wasn't the whole truth, if you've had to rebuild your understanding of someone you thought you knew, you're not alone.